Hey there, everybody. Jeff Danwick here with Our Curious World, bringing you another story of the mysterious, the unexplained, and the just plain weird. Though this channel tends to concentrate on mysteries having to do with the paranormal, I find that mysteries are not just confined to UFOs, Bigfoot, and ghosts. Mysteries exist all around us, in the world of science and history and politics, and not surprisingly, in the world of religion as well. Which is why I thought I would change pace a little and look at a mystery that has always intrigued me from the Bible. What mystery is that, you ask? Well, it's the story of Judas Iscariot, the man who supposedly betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. The mystery in this case is not whether he did it or what happened to him afterwards, but why he really did it. The answer may surprise you. So let's get into it. Ready? Perhaps few stories in the Bible are as well known as that of Judas Iscariot, the man who, at least according to the Bible and legend, betrayed an itinerant Jewish rabbi named Jesus of Nazareth to the Jewish authorities, a move that eventually led to Jesus' death by crucifixion on the cross. According to tradition, Judas betrayed Jesus out of greed, in this case a few pieces of silver, and ended up, depending upon which account you believe, either so overcome by guilt over the act that he hanged himself, or, in another account, that he wasn't remorseful about his treachery at all and died when he fell down, causing his intestines to spill out, an unusually grisly demise, I submit. So which is it? Did he hang himself, or did he split open when he fell down? Was he remorseful or boastful about what he had done? And most important of all, why did he do it in the first place? Was it greed, ignorance, the quest for power? This is what we will try to determine. Before going any further, however, I think it's important to understand where I'm coming from. The viewer should know that I am approaching the subject from the perspective of logic, history, and psychology, and not from a religious perspective. This is not a Christian channel, but it's purely secular in nature. And while I would be less than honest if I tried to maintain that I have no background in the faith, after all, I was actually an evangelical Christian myself over 20 years. Today I look at Christianity and the man behind it, Jesus, from a decidedly secular or historical perspective, unfettered by the restrictions of faith and free to explore various options in regard to both Jesus and Christianity in general. Naturally, this may entice any Christians out there who might be watching to try and reconvert me or otherwise bring me back into the fold, but I would kindly ask you not to do so. I'm quite happy with my current spiritual beliefs and have no desire to return to structured religion, nor am I interested in engaging in a debate on the subject. Let's just consider me a lost cause and leave it at that, okay? Further, and while I realize that approaching religious subjects from a purely secular perspective may turn some viewers off, I ask you to stick with me here. I'm not trying to destroy anyone's faith, but simply look at an old and much revered story from a perspective that you may not have considered before, and hopefully in a way that you might find interesting. Be you a believer or a heathen like myself. With that out of the way then, and if I haven't lost you yet, let's consider the specific details of Jesus' actions as recorded in the four Gospels. But before we do that, let's look at the man himself. So who is this Judas Iscariot, and why did he become so infamous? Now, Judas Iscariot is listed in all four Gospels as having been one of Jesus' original disciples. As a side note, some modern scholars have questioned whether Judas, or any of the disciples for that matter, actually existed. But for our purposes, I'm going to work from the premise that he was an actual historical figure and not some later fabrication. In any case, since the name Judas was an especially common one at the time, he is one of the few disciples who is listed as having a surname, in this case Iscariot, which may be a reference to his village of birth, the town of Kerioth, effectively making Iscariot a Greek translation meaning man of Kerioth. In any case, he was depicted as essentially the treasurer of the group and the man most likely responsible for taking care of the various logistical requirements of Jesus' ministry. In fact, he may have been the one who reserved and paid for the eating establishment the Last Supper was held in. As such, it would appear that others put a good deal of faith in Judas, though there is one brief account in the Gospel of John that maintains that some suspected him of stealing from their funds. I suspect, however, that this may have been a bit of propagandizing on the part of whomever actually penned the Gospel of John, and no, it wasn't the disciple John himself. He had been dead for many years by the time the Gospel was likely written, and who was already familiar with the story of Judas's treachery and was simply trying to reinforce the belief that he was a man of dubious morals. Of course, if he really was pilfering from the ministry purse and some of the disciples suspected him of doing so, why would they continue to trust him afterwards? It just doesn't make sense. In any case, Judas appears to have been with Jesus from the beginning, preached alongside him for almost 2 years, and endured many of the hardships and dangers inherent to any such ministry at the time. He may have even been one of Jesus' smartest disciples, as evidenced by the degree of responsibility they afforded him. And although this is purely speculative, he may possibly have been one of the few disciples who was literate, which was the reason he was given such responsibility. Unfortunately, that's about all we know of the man, who isn't mentioned much until he performs his act of betrayal. While there are hints of Judas's treachery in the aforementioned Gospel of John, as I just pointed out, and nowhere else for that matter, all 4 Gospels at least agree that Judas came up with a plan to betray Jesus at the Last Supper, and is even identified by Jesus himself as the one who will betray him. Well, there is no reason given for the betrayal. Judas and Jesus do not appear to be arguing or otherwise be at odds with each other. It simply says that at some point he left the gathering to tell the religious authorities where Jesus' hiding place was. John's Gospel actually says that Satan entered into him, whatever that means, suggesting that he may not have even been acting according to his own free will, which opens up a whole other can of worms. In any case, he later showed up in the Garden of Gethsemane with a small band of soldiers, at which point Jesus was taken into custody and marched to King Herod's palace. And by the way, if you don't know who King Herod was, he was the puppet ruler of the Jews under the Roman authority at the time, in case you were wondering. So what happens next has been reenacted a million times in church passion plays and in many a Hollywood epic. Jesus is marched before Herod, who makes a few curt statements before having him sent to the Sanhedrin, which is the Jewish religious governing body, for judgment. They, of course, find him guilty of blasphemy and have him sent to the local Roman governor, in this case one Pontius Pilate, for final disposition. After questioning a largely uncooperative Jesus and inquiring of the crowds massed outside his palace what he should do with their Messiah, who demand that they crucify him, Pilate has him sent off to his death. That, in a nutshell, is the basic passion of the Christ story. Okay, so let's unpack this. According to the Gospel of Matthew, the only one that mentions the deal made between the high priest and Judas, and the only one which specifically mentions 30 pieces of silver, there is no rationale being given for Judas's decision to betray Jesus. Judas just sets a price for his cooperation, and one that isn't all that exorbitant considering the risk he was taking, and they readily agree. But don't you find that a little strange? I mean, wouldn't you have wanted to know why one of Jesus' closest disciples, a man who had been by his side for the last 2 years and endured all the hardships that entailed, would decide to betray him, and for what could only be really considered a pittance? I'd be curious, but there's not a word about it in any of the Gospels. What's even stranger, however, is what happens later. Once Jesus is being led to his death, Judas apparently has a dramatic change of heart regarding what he has done and tries to give the money back. The priest won't take it, however, because it's blood money, at which point Judas just leaves it at the money with the priests and departs to look for a tree limb from which to hang himself. Now, that doesn't sound like like the actions of a thief to me, but of a man genuinely remorseful for what he had done, which is an important point that many Christians tend to overlook. And this is where the mystery starts. Why the remorse? Why return the money? Why take his own life? Something bigger is going on here. What if Judas didn't betray Jesus for financial gain at all? What if this was just a ruse designed to set into motion a series of events that just happened to turn out far different than the way Judas imagined they would? Let's say Judas was not greedy or a disillusioned disciple at all, but a man who was so convinced that Jesus was the true Messiah that he was willing to do whatever it took to install Jesus in that role, even to the point of pretending to betray the man for 30 pieces of silver. But why would he do that, you ask? Could it have been because he assumed that if Jesus were put into such a position, he would have to profess his messiahship in front of the assembled Jewish leaders, and in doing so kick off the very revolution Judas so eagerly anticipated? Considered from Judas's perspective, here's a man who was utterly convinced that Jesus was the chosen one of God, sent to kick the hated Romans out and restore the kingdom of Israel, just as the Maccabean brothers had done to the Seleucid Greeks almost 200 years earlier. However, he was frustrated that Jesus refused to assume the mantle. Why couldn't he just come right out and say it, that he was the Messiah? But why was Jesus so hesitant? What was he waiting for? Was he afraid? Was he loath to spill the blood that would be necessary to forcefully expel the Romans from the city? That must have been it, Judas thought to himself. Jesus was a man who taught of love and forgiveness, and one who abhorred violence, even if it was God ordained and sanctified. Perhaps all Jesus needed was a little push, which Jesus was more than willing to give him. Pretend to betray his master to get him arrested and brought before the authorities, where he would have to declare his messiahship and perhaps even perform a few miracles as proof that he was who he said he was. And everything would quickly fall into place. Once the Jewish authorities were convinced that Jesus was the real deal and not just another pretender to the throne, word would spread quickly throughout the city, a city already swelled to twice its normal population by pilgrims coming to celebrate the Passover. And the small Roman garrison would have no choice but to flee for their lives. Then it would simply be a matter of clearing the rest of the countryside of the stench of Roman rule in Israel, with Jesus as its leader, and perhaps with Judas as one of his top lieutenants, would reestablish God's kingdom on earth. Victory was in their grasp if only Jesus did his part when the time came. It must have seemed so simple. But things went terribly, horribly wrong. Not only did Jesus fail to declare himself the Messiah in front of either Herod or the Jewish leaders, but he even ended up in front of Pilate, where once again he failed to declare his messiahship. The result? He was seen as just another failed Messiah who paid for his foolishness with his very life. Judas must have been devastated. He was so sure that Jesus was the Messiah. How could he have been so wrong, so misguided, so betrayed? Well, what could he do? Jesus was on his way to Golgotha. The disciples had scattered. Even the throngs that a week earlier had been shouting hallelujah when he entered the city on a donkey's back were now screaming, "Crucify him!" Perhaps to assuage his guilt, he tried to return the money he had taken, only to be told it was blood money, which it truly was. Despondent, perhaps desperate, and perhaps now even a little insane, he did the only thing he could think of to assuage his pain and found a bit of rope and looked for the nearest low-hanging branch. I can't say I would blame him either. What would you do if everything you had come to believe with all your heart turned out to be one massive lie? Think carefully before you answer that. What about the other account as told in the book of Acts that records an entirely different reaction than the one told in Matthew's gospel? In that book, Judas shows no remorse at all. It is reportedly to have used his ill-gotten gain to buy a field known as the Potter's Field, shortly after which he fell down and somehow his innards burst open, probably as a way of God punishing him with an exclamation mark for betraying the Messiah. Obviously, the two accounts can't both be true. One of them, potentially both of them, must be a fabrication. Either Judas was repentant or he wasn't. Either he returned the money or he kept it. Either he hanged himself or he burst open. Which is it? I don't know about you, but since Matthew's gospel was written years before Luke's account in the book of Acts and seems to be more consistent with what we understand about human psychology, that's the one I choose to go with. Again, that's just my opinion. You're free to disagree, but the one thing you can't do is reconcile the two accounts. Well, actually, the idea that Judas may have burst open might be reconciled if it were a byproduct of him hanging himself. If his body was not discovered for days or even weeks after his death, during which time it bloated beneath the brutal Middle Eastern sun, upon being cut down it may well have split open, which is a gruesome but not unreasonable possibility. The fact that bursting open upon hitting the ground sounds like the more hideous death might have made it appear the more just way for a traitor to die, which is why it made its way into Luke's account but went unmentioned in Matthew's story. So Judas didn't betray Jesus out of greed or disillusionment, but out of a misguided faith. It's not that Judas considered Jesus a failed Messiah, but that he overestimated, or more precisely, assumed him to be more than he truly was. And when that truth came out, he couldn't handle the cognitive dissonance that resulted. It wasn't greed that betrayed Jesus, but faith. It's a curious thought. Hopefully this video has forced you to reconsider this whole concept of Judas as the betrayer of Christ, as he has been traditionally taught. Plus, before being too quick to judge and condemn the man for his actions, consider the fact that without Judas betraying Jesus, there is no crucifixion, and with it, no resurrection and no atonement for sin. In fact, without Judas, there is no Christianity. I leave it for you to decide whether that would be a good thing or a bad thing. So if you found my take on this story interesting, you may want to read a novel I wrote a few years ago that revolves around this idea, entitled A Friend of God, The Passion of Judas Iscariot. Though a fictionalized and highly speculative account of Jesus' and Judas's last week on earth, I do follow the gospel narratives pretty closely, not in an effort to provide you with another timeline, but to show you what sort of things may have been taking place behind the scenes. In effect, it is the passion of the Christ as seen through Judas's eyes, which might tell you more about what might have happened that week almost 2,000 years ago than what has been traditionally taught. The book is still in print and available through both Amazon and Barnes & Noble's websites, so maybe check it out. Say, if you like this video, I'd really appreciate if you hit that like button and consider subscribing to see more stories like this from our curious world. It's the only way to grow this channel, so your help is not only important, but is greatly appreciated. So here's your final thought of the day. There is nothing more dangerous in the world than your own erroneous beliefs. Bye for now. See you later.